Old Hollywood wasn't just about glitz, glamour, and perfectly polished stars. Behind the velvet curtains lurked some truly bizarre, eccentric, and forgotten figures. These aren't your usual icons. These are the misfits, the recluses, the ones who whispered to ghosts, threw wild parties with pet monkeys, or vanished into the shadows of their own legend. This is the hidden, weirder side of classic Hollywood, the names you don't hear in film school. Stick around, because you'll be surprised just how strange some of these stars really were. Lord Buckley, the hip aristocrat who spoke in jazz. Imagine a man in a tuxedo with a waxed mustache calling himself His Royal Hipness, speaking like a Shakespearean noble, but all in jazz slang. That was Lord Buckley, one of the strangest, most hypnotic performers to ever swirl through Hollywood's outer orbit. Born Richard Marle Buckley, this eccentric soul turned the English language into a surreal playground. He performed wild monologues that blended beat poetry, gospel rhythms, and psychedelic nonsense decades before psychedelia was a thing. He'd take classic figures like Jesus, Gandhi, or Lincoln and retell their stories using what he called hypsomantic, a language only he seemed fluent in. For example, his version of the Gettysburg Address began, "For big hits and 7 licks ago, hour before Daddy swung forth on this sweet groovy pad." You get the idea. He wasn't just a nightclub act. Buckley had a small cult following in the Hollywood underground. Lenny Bruce idolized him. Frank Zappa credited him as a major influence. Even Bob Dylan and George Harrison called him a genius. Yet the mainstream barely knew he existed. In real life, he dressed like a turn-of-the-century English gentleman, drank like a poet, and seemed to float in his own strange cloud of cool. His performances weren't just comedy, they were rituals, sermons, hallucinations. But his world didn't quite fit the system. He lived large, talked bigger, and didn't follow rules. The establishment didn't know what to make of him, and frankly, most people still don't. Lord Buckley wasn't just weird, he was an entire genre unto himself. And trust us, this list is only getting stranger from here. Thelma Todd, the ice cream blonde who vanished into a mystery. Thelma Todd was more than just a pretty face in a slapstick routine. With her sharp wit, bright presence, and natural comic timing, she became one of the most beloved actresses of early 1930s Hollywood. Nicknamed the Ice Cream Blonde for her platinum looks and sunny appeal, Todd starred in over 100 films, often holding her own alongside the likes of the Marx Brothers and Laurel and Hardy. But while audiences saw her as the cheerful comedic foil, her real life was far more complex and far stranger. Away from the cameras, Thelma was ambitious in ways that set her apart from her peers. She didn't just act, she built. She opened her own successful cafe, perched along the Pacific Coast Highway, which quickly became a hotspot for both the glamorous and the dangerous. Hollywood elite rubbed elbows there, but so did mob-connected figures with reputations that made even the boldest stars nervous. Despite the risks, Todd was known to speak her mind, stand her ground, and run her business with fierce independence, an attitude not often welcomed in a woman of that era. Then, in December 1935, everything changed. Todd failed to appear at a scheduled event, and after a brief search, she was found in her garage, inside her car. The official explanation was accepted by some, but many in Hollywood immediately sensed that the story didn't add up. Her cafe, her connections, her confidence, it all seemed to point to something deeper. Whispers of cover-ups and quiet threats followed, and her name became forever linked to one of Hollywood's most persistent unsolved mysteries. Thelma Todd's story is a perfect cocktail of charm, ambition, and intrigue. And as strange as her tale was, she's only the beginning of the bizarre personalities hiding in Hollywood's golden past. Step and Fetchit, the silent millionaire who spoke in code. In the shadows of old Hollywood spotlight, few figures were as controversial or as misunderstood as Step and Fetchit, born Lincoln Perry. To audiences of the 1930s, he was a caricature, the slow-talking, lazy servant who stumbled through scenes with exaggerated deference. But behind that persona was a deeply complicated man who crafted an identity so layered and subversive, it still sparks debate to this day. Fetchit wasn't just the first black actor to gain major recognition in Hollywood, he was also the first to become a millionaire. At a time when roles for black actors were limited to stereotypes, he leaned into the system and found a way to flip it. What many saw as buffoonery, he claimed was strategy. In interviews, he described his character as someone so clever, he played dumb just to make others do his work for him. It was satire wrapped in performance, hidden behind the grin of a man who knew exactly how he was being seen, and used that to his advantage. Yet this double life came with a cost. Hollywood embraced the persona, but had no place for the man behind it. Off-screen, Perry was sharp, well-read, and prone to philosophical musings. He clashed with studios, demanded higher pay, and openly challenged the industry's boundaries. These moves were seen as insubordination, and over time, he was quietly pushed out. For decades, his legacy was dismissed or vilified, but in recent years, a more nuanced picture has emerged. Stepin Fetchit may have played the fool, but the man behind the name was anything but. His story is a strange and unsettling mirror held up to Hollywood itself, and proof that weirdness, when looked at closely, often masks something far more profound. Margaret Rutherford, the ghost-hunting spinster with a secret past. With her bulging eyes, eccentric manner, and unmistakable voice, Margaret Rutherford looked like someone who had wandered out of a Victorian painting and into the middle of a murder mystery. Best known for playing the delightfully nosy Miss Marple in the 1960s film adaptations of Agatha Christie's novels, Rutherford built a career on being unapologetically odd. But what audiences loved as charming quirks on screen were often glimpses of a truly peculiar and haunted inner world. Born into a family shadowed by tragedy and instability, Rutherford was raised in secrecy after a scandal involving her father, whose mental health crisis led to his long-term institutionalization. As an adult, she harbored a lifelong fear that she might one day follow the same path. That fear manifested in curious behaviors. She was reportedly obsessed with psychic phenomena, routinely held seances, and was convinced she could communicate with the dead. She surrounded herself with talismans and rituals, as if keeping the darkness at bay through sheer force of eccentricity. Despite her deeply rooted anxieties, Rutherford never allowed herself to be defined by them. On stage and screen, she created a singular type of British character, the formidable yet endearing older woman who seemed to operate by her own set of rules. Off stage, she was just as unorthodox. She dressed unconventionally, spoke in riddles, and at times displayed moods that swung between theatrical exuberance and withdrawn melancholy. She was awarded an Oscar in her 70s, but true to form, she kept it hidden in a cupboard, under a doily, not out of modesty, but as if the statue itself might be watching her. Margaret Rutherford didn't just play eccentrics, she was one. And the further you go into her story, the more you realize that sometimes the strangest characters aren't written, they're lived. Paul Lynde, the man who laughed through the mask. To most of America, Paul Lynde was the funny man with the cutting voice, sarcastic, snarky, and just a little bit strange. Best known as the center square on Hollywood squares and for his roles in shows like Bewitched, Lynde delivered punchlines with a razor's edge, turning camp into an art form. But behind that signature laugh and biting, it was a deeply complicated figure who never quite fit into the world that made him famous. Lynde's on-screen persona was flamboyant, theatrical, and unforgettable, but was also carefully coded. In an era when certain truths were kept carefully hidden, he lived a double life, navigating fame with a cocktail of charm, deflection, and biting humor. His jokes often hinted at things unsaid, loaded with double meanings that flew over the heads of some while striking a knowing chord with others. He was hilarious but never safe, always laughing but never quite relaxed. Off-screen, Lynde's eccentricity became legend. He was known for sudden mood swings, wild parties, and unpredictable behavior. Colleagues admired his talent, but often tiptoed around his volatility. He could be the life of the party one moment and disappear without a word the next. There were stories of him wandering hotel halls late at night, holding court with strangers, or isolating himself for days in a haze of self-reflection and bitterness. Fame didn't soothe him. If anything, it seemed to amplify his contradictions. Despite his success, Lynde never seemed at peace with his own persona. He was always performing, even when no one was watching. His humor, brilliant as it was, often felt like a mask, a sharp, glittering shield against a world that wasn't built for someone like him. Paul Lynde made millions laugh, but few truly knew him. And that makes his place on this list not just earned, but essential. Ramon Novarro, the silent star who lived in shadows. In the early days of Hollywood, Ramon Novarro was the kind of star studios dreamed of. With his striking features, soulful eyes, and magnetic screen presence, he was hailed as the next great romantic lead, often described as Rudolph Valentino's heir. Audiences swooned over him in silent epics like Ben-Hur, 1925, and studios positioned him as the ultimate symbol of exotic allure. But while his face was on billboards across the country, Novarro himself seemed to exist just slightly out of reach, cloaked in a kind of personal mystery that only deepened with time. What made Navarro truly unusual wasn't just his superstardom during the silent era, it was the way he retreated from it. Unlike his peers, he had little interest in the endless spotlight. He valued privacy to an almost obsessive degree. After the transition to talkies, he stepped back, even when the industry still had a place for him. He kept a close circle, turned down major roles, and became known for his reclusive lifestyle, often staying home in his modest Los Angeles house filled with religious iconography, art books, and antique furniture. But the contradiction between his public image and his private world was striking. He played bold, romantic heroes on screen, yet in life, he was cautious, spiritual, and consumed by inner conflict. His home was said to be eerily quiet, like stepping into a preserved dream, and visitors often remarked that it felt less like a movie star's residence and more like a personal sanctuary built to keep the outside world at bay. Ramon Novarro didn't rage against Hollywood or chase it. He simply stepped away from its center, quietly, and lived in the in-between. His story isn't loud, it's haunting. And it proves that some of Hollywood's strangest figures were the ones who barely made a sound. Baby Peggy, the child star who outlived her legend. Long before Shirley Temple charmed audiences with her dimples, Baby Peggy was America's sweetheart. In the early 1920s, she was one of the most bankable stars in the world, a toddler dressed in grown-up clothes, performing slapstick routines alongside adults, and commanding a salary that rivaled major studio heads. By the age of 5, she had made over 150 short films, starred in several feature-length movies, and had endorsement deals that plastered her face on everything from dolls to milk bottles. But behind the wide-eyed charm and curls was a child caught in a whirlwind far stranger than any Hollywood script. Born Diana Sarah Carey, Baby Peggy lived a life that barely felt real, even to her. Her father, a former stuntman, tightly controlled every aspect of her career. She worked long hours, performed dangerous stunts with no stand-ins, and had no real sense of childhood outside of the set. Fame, for her, wasn't exciting, it was routine. By the time she turned 7, it was also over. A dispute between her father and her studio abruptly ended her career, and with no safeguards in place, the fortune she had earned was quickly lost. For decades afterward, Diana lived in relative anonymity, working ordinary jobs and rarely speaking of her past. It wasn't until much later in life, well into her 80s, that she began writing and reflecting on the surreal reality she had once inhabited. Far from bitter, her recollections were filled with insight and a strange sense of distance, as though she had played a character in someone else's dream. Baby Peggy's story is a rare one, a tale of early fame, quiet erasure, and graceful reemergence. She didn't burn out. She faded into the background, and then quietly told us what it was like to survive the circus. Marie Prevost, the party girl who laughed through the fall. In the 1920s, Marie Prevost was the epitome of Hollywood charm, vivacious, funny, and unafraid to poke fun at herself. A former Max Sennett bathing beauty, she rose through the ranks of silent film with a wink and a wisecrack, often cast as the flirty, free-spirited woman who could drink and joke with the boys. Her comedic timing made her a favorite among directors and audiences alike. But behind the cheeky persona was a woman whose life took a strange and quietly tragic turn, one that Hollywood was never quite sure how to talk about. Marie was known for her bold spirit and rebellious streak. She partied hard in an era when flappers ruled the screen and prohibition ruled the streets. She spoke her mind, challenged the image studios tried to craft for her, and refused to be boxed into the role of a passive starlet. But as the silent era gave way to talkies, Marie, like many of her peers, struggled to transition. Roles became fewer, her confidence waned, and the industry, once eager to promote her, moved on without ceremony. Rather than chase relevance, Marie withdrew. She developed eccentric habits, became increasingly private, and seemed to fade into a world of her own. Those who visited her in her later years describe a woman who still laughed easily, but whose eyes held a certain detached melancholy. Her apartment was reportedly cluttered with mementos of her earlier fame, movie posters, scrapbooks, old studio gifts, as if she had turned her home into a quiet museum of a life that once sparkled brightly. Marie Prevost wasn't forgotten because she lacked talent. She was forgotten because Hollywood has always struggled to understand what to do with people who don't stay in their assigned roles. Her story is strange, somber, and deeply human, and it reminds us that the weirdest stories aren't always loud. Sometimes they just quietly disappear. Erich von Stroheim, the man who directed Madness. To call Erich von Stroheim eccentric is an understatement. He didn't just direct films, he constructed entire universes, down to the stitching on undergarments that the camera would never see. Nicknamed the man you love to hate for the cruel aristocrats he often portrayed, von Stroheim was both a cinematic genius and a legendary control freak. In the silent era, few figures were as feared, admired, and whispered about behind studio doors. Von Stroheim built his persona like a fortress. Though he was born in Austria, he exaggerated his own biography, claiming to be an aristocrat, a former military officer, even a count. On set, he wore a monocle and carried himself with military precision, barking orders with theatrical flair. But beneath the posturing was a filmmaker obsessed with realism to a degree that often bordered on the absurd. For his magnum opus, Greed, 1924, he famously shot over 80 hours of footage and demanded real gold coins, real rotting meat, and even insisted that actors wear authentic period-appropriate underwear, even if it wouldn't be shown on screen. Studios were baffled by him. His attention to detail was unmatched, but his refusal to compromise made him nearly impossible to work with. Most of his films were cut down or re-edited without his consent, leaving him furious and estranged from a Hollywood system he once dominated. He saw cinema as sacred, a place for total immersion, and he refused to dilute his vision for money, time, or convenience. Off-set, von Stroheim was just as rigid and theatrical. He lived as if constantly performing the role of Erich von Stroheim, the tortured genius. And perhaps he was. His career faded as talkies rose, but his legend remained, not just as a director, but as a symbol of what happens when brilliance refuses to compromise. Von Stroheim didn't just make films. He built worlds, strange, obsessive, extravagant worlds, and insisted we take them seriously. Even now, it's hard to look away. Alla Nazimova, the queen of the Garden of Allah. In the silent era, Alla Nazimova was a force of nature, an actress, director, and producer who didn't just break Hollywood rules, but seemed to exist in a world entirely of her own design. Born in Crimea and trained in Moscow's theater elite, she brought European avant-garde drama to Hollywood long before it knew what to do with it. She spoke in riddles, surrounded herself with poets and painters, and created films that felt like fever dreams, lush, symbolic, and way ahead of their time. But it was her life off-screen that truly earned her a place among Hollywood's most eccentric icons. Nazimova was openly rebellious in every sense. In an era obsessed with image control, she lived outside the margins. She turned her Sunset Boulevard mansion into a bohemian sanctuary known as the Garden of Allah, a lavish estate where actors, writers, dancers, and thinkers gathered in secret. It was a safe space for outsiders, dreamers, and those who couldn't, or wouldn't, fit into Hollywood's public mold. Parties there were the stuff of legend, dramatic, philosophical, and wildly free, with a guest list that spanned from Rudolph Valentino to the unnamed misfits of the city's underbelly. She also pioneered what she called sewing circles, coded gatherings of women in same-sex relationships who found freedom in her orbit. Nazimova didn't advertise her private life, but she didn't hide it either. Her strength wasn't in defiance, but in indifference to convention. She lived truthfully, even if the world wasn't ready. Nazimova's film career faded with the arrival of talkies, but her legend endured through whispers, memoirs, and the stories passed from one artist to another. She wasn't just strange for the sake of being different. She built a space where difference could thrive. In a town built on illusion, Alla Nazimova turned her life into a kind of theater, one where the curtains never closed. Lupe Valles, the Spitfire who set Hollywood on fire. In a town obsessed with control and polished personas, Lupe Valles stormed onto the scene like a hurricane. Born in Mexico and bursting with energy, she quickly earned the nickname, the Mexican Spitfire, and not just for the film series she starred in. Valles brought chaos, charm, and charisma in equal measure. She didn't just act, she erupted. Everything about her, from her laugh to her temper, was big, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. What set Lupe apart wasn't just her talent, though she had plenty of it. It was her refusal to behave the way Hollywood expected her to. She spoke in a thick accent and made no effort to soften it. She made jokes at her own expense before anyone else could. She flouted studio decorum, started arguments at parties, and once famously tossed a plate of food at a date in a restaurant, then laughed so hard about it, the story spread faster than her films did. Despite the chaos, Lupe had an undeniable command of the screen. She could flip from comedy to drama in a heartbeat, and directors knew that even when she went off script, magic often followed. But she was also emotionally intense, fiercely romantic, and known for high-profile relationships that often ended in fireworks. She lived like every day was her last, and expected others to match her energy. Few could. Her off-screen life was filled with sharp turns and dramatic choices. Friends and colleagues often didn't know what Lupe they'd encounter. The dazzling hostess, the furious lover, or the quiet, introspective woman who sometimes vanished into herself without warning. Lupe Valles wasn't eccentric in a subtle way. She was the spectacle. In many ways, she embodied the very thing Hollywood tried to control: raw, unfiltered human emotion. And that made her unforgettable. John Carradine, the Shakespearean ghoul who never broke character. With his gaunt face, hollow eyes, and voice like a haunted cathedral, John Carradine looked like he had stepped out of a Gothic novel and into a Hollywood soundstage. A prolific actor with over 200 film credits, he was best known for his roles in horror films and B-movie oddities, but there was nothing B-grade about his personality. Carradine lived as though he were on stage at all times, blurring the line between performance and real life in ways that made even his closest friends unsure where the character ended. Though he came from humble beginnings, Carradine styled himself like an old-world gentleman of letters. He spoke in long, rolling sentences, often quoting Shakespeare or Poe without warning. He once claimed to have memorized more than 10,000 lines of classical verse, and he'd recite entire soliloquies over dinner as if summoned by ghosts. For him, everyday life was too dull, so he reinvented it. He was notoriously eccentric in both his habits and his lifestyle. He shunned mainstream Hollywood social circles in favor of dive bars and shadowy theater troupes. He would often travel cross-country by bus instead of by plane, claiming it gave him time to think. He collected odd trinkets, wore capes well into the 1960s, and could frequently be seen wandering studio lots barefoot, deep in philosophical conversation with himself or with no one at all. Carradine wasn't just weird, he was mythic. He built a career on the fringe, never chasing stardom, but always stealing scenes. Even in the smallest roles, he loomed large, like a ghost who knew he belonged in every frame. In the end, John Carradine didn't adapt to Hollywood. Hollywood simply made room for him because there was no one else like him. Old Hollywood is often remembered for its glamour, but behind the polished images were individuals who defied easy labels. The stars on this list weren't just actors, they were artists, misfits, visionaries, and rebels. Their eccentricities weren't flaws to be hidden. They were reflections of deeper stories, shaped by fame, pressure, creativity, and often loneliness. Some lived loudly, others quietly faded, but all left behind more than just film reels. They left mystery, wonder, and legacy. In honoring these uniquely strange figures, we're reminded that Hollywood's true soul was never just its leading men and ingenues. It was also the outsiders, the ones who broke the mold, bent the rules, or simply didn't care to play the game at all. If you enjoyed this dive into the forgotten, fascinating weirdness of old Hollywood, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that explore the stranger corners of cinema history. And we'd love to hear from you. Which star on this list surprised you the most? Drop a comment below and let us know who you think was the weirdest of them all. Thanks for watching, and stay strange.